Okay, what I want to do this afternoon, in a sense, is to look to see to what extent the general election, which was called by the Prime Minister Theresa May in order to secure a mandate for her vision of Brexit. We know that she didn't get the outcome that she wanted, but the question is to what extent actually did the outcome of the election reflect, was influenced by the fallout from the EU referendum held 12 months earlier. So the key question then is, to what extent did Brexit, but not just Brexit as an isolated phenomenon, but also the issues and values and arguments that Brexit raised, influence, now key word here, aggregate movements. One of my complaints occasionally about my political science colleagues is that they spend a great deal of time trying to understand what individuals do and forget that actually in politics it's aggregates that matter, particularly so far as political power is concerned. So I'm not going to show you a great deal about statistical models that show you that indeed once you've controlled for 15 dozen million things that people's attitudes towards Brexit is indeed have an independent impact on how people voted. Rather, I'm interested much more in what happens to the aggregate pattern of voting behaviour in the wake of the election, and focusing in particular on Conservative and Labour, who after all, for the first time since the 1970s, got over 80% of the vote and therefore are clearly the central players in the game. In particular, what I'm interested in is that insofar as Brexit did apparently change the aggregate patterns of voting behaviour in the UK, is that something that reinforced our traditional understanding of British politics? Is it the case, for example, that not only have we returned therefore to two-party politics apparently in terms of the proportions of people who vote for Conservative or Labour, which I've already said, highest for 40 years, but is it also the case that we have returned to a situation where if you're a little bit middle class you vote Conservative, if you're a little bit working class you vote Labour, and that the traditional underlying class divide of British politics, which traditionally underlay the two-party system of the immediate post-war period, is that also now something that's been reinforced and reinvigorated? Or actually is Brexit a disruptive phenomenon which, insofar as it was influencing people in the election, how the patterns that emerged as a result cut across existing demographic and value divisions in British politics. And in answering that last bit, I realised this after I put this lecture together. In many respects, I'm going back to work that I and Anthony Heath and Roger Giles wrote, again, a long time ago, 30 years ago, called How Britain Votes, in which in particular we started trying to lay out the extent to which voting behaviour was related to people's values. And you will see some of the ideas that were in that book being used in order to understand this election 30 years later, which all goes to prove there really isn't anything terribly new in political science. What we do is to endlessly recycle ideas and concepts to the new circumstances. But hey, maybe that still means we get insight. How am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to use a variety of sources. I'm not going to confine myself to one source. I'm going to make quite a lot of bit of use of something of the British Social Attitude Survey, which is an annual survey conducted every year. It's a very high quality survey. It's still done the old fashioned way. You knock on somebody's door and you find out who lives there and you choose somebody at random. The whole thing, the individuals are chosen at random. Why am I choosing 2015? Because one of the things I'm going to be doing a great deal of is comparing what happened in 2017 with what happened in 2015. So most of what I'm going to show you about what happened in 2015 comes from that source. But one of the things that Nuts and Social Research, which Mark has mentioned I'm quite heavily involved with, has started doing is also running a so-called Mixedmode random probability panel. Now what do I mean by that? Well, you've probably all heard of YouGov. Okay, now YouGov is a panel of many thousands of people who periodically are invited to fill in an interview. But there are two constraints on that. One perhaps now less important than it used to be, but it's still there. The first is it's only done over the internet, so there's still about 20% of the population that doesn't use the internet or hardly uses it. And the second thing is that the people who are on YouGov's panel in some way or another have volunteered stroke been persuaded to take part. In contrast, the NatSen panel are people who were originally chosen at random to be interviewed for the British Social Attitude Survey, who then have gone on to agree to respond to subsequent interviews. And if they don't answer online, we start ringing them up and say, hey, what are your answers to this question? And it's done over quite an extended period of time. So that's the origin of that. This is work that's just beginning to come out. We put some of it out last Sunday about the Labour Party, and it was on Peston on Sunday, and more of it will be coming out this weekend about the Conservatives. Third source, which is a major source for the study of voting behaviour in the UK in 2015 and 2017, is the so-called British Election Study Internet Panel, which in fact is done by YouGov, and it's like a YouGov survey. But its great advantage is it's very, very large, and so I'm also on occasion going to draw from that for some of my purposes. And then occasionally you will also see I'm using the odd commercial opinion poll of the kind of thing that's published in a newspaper. So I'm using a diversity of sources because none of these sources individually is necessarily capable of answering all the issues and questions that I'm interested in. And partly also what you'll see I will do on occasion, I'm going to say the same thing twice. I'm going to show you two pieces of evidence, both from different sources that may have been conducted in a different way, in the hope that that helps to convince you that this is not, what I'm showing you is not some oddball result from some odd survey, but actually is something that's been replicated. Now, in many cases I could show you 5 or 6 different surveys all showing the same thing. You'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to do that. But bear in mind, those of you who are students, one of the things that we're always concerned about if you're involved in empirical political science is how robust is the evidence that we have. You all know enough about polls already to know that this is potentially a fragile world. So I hope that by showing you that two different sources show you the same thing, that it probably is, it is actually true, despite the limitations of survey research. Okay, so let me start with election, a once upon a time story about elections, which, like all once upon a time stories, is kind of a little bit of a characterization. What I'm showing you here is the value dimension that traditionally underlies British party politics. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, you're used to the idea that we think of the Labour Party being on the left, the Conservatives being on the right. What do we usually mean by that? Well, usually the heart of an election is, well, do we want the state perhaps to do a little bit more and maybe make society a bit more equal, which is usually the Labour argument? Or do we think that the state should do a little bit less because as a result maybe the economy will grow a bit more, and hey, maybe we shouldn't be quite so concerned about inequality, which tends to be the Conservative argument. So one of the things that British Social Attitudes does on a regular basis is to ask a series of questions like ordinary people don't get their fair share of the nation's wealth, the government should do more to reduce income differences, etc. And we put all those questions together in order to measure whether somebody is broadly on the left, on the right, or in the middle on these kinds of issues. So the people here who are marked in blue, these are all people who basically amongst the third or so who are most left-wing in response to those survey questions. The people in orange are the people of the third or so who tend to be in the centre, and the people in grey are those who are on the right. And what you will notice, yes, as you might expect, that people who are on the right are pretty likely to vote for the Conservatives. In 2015 British Social Attitudes, 2/3 of those people whom we measure as being on the right voted for the Conservatives. The Labour Party tends to do better amongst those on the left. And so far as UKIP and the Liberal Democrats are concerned, didn't make a great deal of difference. Notice, by the way, on this measure, UKIP voters are not right-wing voters. Notice that. We have to get at something else in order to understand the nature of UKIP and indeed the nature of the Liberal Democrats. But so far as Conservative and Labour are concerned, clearly if you're on the left, you're more likely to vote Labour. If you're on the right, you're more likely to vote the Conservative. So this is the traditional value division of British politics, about which, as I said, we were writing about 30 years ago. What it was about, at least so far as Conservative and Labour is concerned, is about much less. Is about what we might call social liberalism versus social conservatism. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a social liberal is essentially somebody who says, well, look, actually, at the end of the day, the morals that you follow, the social mores you follow, the customs that you decide to acknowledge, the symbols within which you may invest a degree of social psychological affinity, these are at the end of the day something for an individual to decide. And you're also somebody who is perfectly relaxed about living in a multicultural, multi-ethnic and maybe multilinguistic environment. At the end of the day, you're somebody who thinks that living with others who have different views, different backgrounds, diverse beliefs, diverse social practices, diverse social norms actually adds to the spice of life. On the other hand, if you're a social conservative, you are somebody who basically feels that at the end of the day, society as a whole has a responsibility to enforce a common moral code, a common set of social mores, maybe adherence to a common set of religious beliefs, certainly following a common set of customs, acknowledging a common set of symbols, and tend to be very reticent about a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic environment. So that's the division I'm talking about. And again, there's a series of questions on British social attitudes which is designed to get at whether you're a social conservative or whether you're a social liberal. So if you're a social conservative, for example, you think that young people just don't have enough respect for tradition. If you're a social liberal, you tend to disagree with that proposition, etc. If you're a social conservative, you believe in hanging and flogging people if they break the law. And if you're a social liberal, you're kind of a bit kinder about these things. Now, what you will notice, there's a bit of a link. Yeah, so if you are a social conservative, you're a bit more likely to vote for the Conservative Party than if you are a social liberal. And the opposite is true for the Labour Party. But as compared with the divisions I've just shown you, there are relatively small differences. In contrast, notice that this is now where we begin to get at the UKIP vote, which is very strongly socially conservative. People call it being right-wing, but actually it's the real description is it's socially conservative. And Liberal Democrats, in contrast, as you might expect from their name, tend to be social liberal. So that's the dimension that has tended to matter for some of our smaller parties. But for our two biggest parties and our two traditional dominating parties, the social liberal versus social conservative dimension has been relatively unimportant. Now, let's compare that with the position in the EU referendum. And first of all, I'm again doing exactly the same analysis, but this time of Remain and of Leave voters. And again, the people on the left-hand side, these are the people who are on the left, people in grey are the people on the right. And you will notice that actually, whether you are left-wing or right-wing, as I have defined it, mattered hardly at all to whether you voted Remain or Leave. This was an issue that completely cut across the traditional value division of British politics. In contrast, as you might expect, given that immigration in particular and issues of sovereignty were central to the EU referendum debate, if you were a social liberal, you were highly likely to vote for Remain. If you were a social conservative, you were highly likely to vote for Leave. So the EU referendum was strongly disruptive of the traditional value divisions of British electoral politics, at least so far as our two largest parties are concerned. What's also true is that the demographic differences that underlie the social liberal versus social conservative division are rather different from the class division, which at least was the traditional division of British two-party politics. So, for example, older people, well, predominantly voted to leave, younger people predominantly voted to remain. One of the ironies of the EU referendum is that the generation of people like myself who were old enough to vote in 1975 and voted at that time to stay in the then so-called common market changed their minds in the ensuing 40 years and were predominantly the group that voted to leave. Another clear central division, which is why the moment you walk on a university campus, you know that the proportion of Remoaners is suddenly going to increase dramatically, is that university graduates voted overwhelmingly to remain, only around a fifth of them voted to leave. In contrast, those with little in the way of educational qualifications overwhelmingly voted to no. These two things, of course, not entirely independent of each other, because older people are much less likely to have much in the way of educational qualifications than are younger people. And in fact, I think in the EU referendum, at least, education was the principal source of division. Again, one of the things we've long known is that universities are institutions that tend to inculcate social liberal values in their members. So for those of your students here, if you want to know what's happening to you, in part you're being socialized into the socially liberal world. This is what institutions like Birmingham University tends to do, particularly, by the way, in the humanities and social sciences. So you really are, which is probably why you're struggling to find anybody who voted leave like you did. Much less of a division by social class in the EU referendum. Again, unsurprisingly, given that professional and managerial occupations tend to be occupied by graduates, there's less of a leave vote there. But once you've dealt with that, actually occupational class, and here I'm using the governmental social class scheme, very little of a difference or a division. And therefore, it probably doesn't surprise you against that backdrop that the way in which people voted in the EU referendum was deeply disruptive so far as our two largest parties are concerned. All the surveys say roughly the same thing. This again is British Social Attitudes. This is a 2016 survey. Just over a half of people who think of themselves as a Conservative supporter voted for leave. The rest voted Remain, so actually a majority of Conservatives voted against David Cameron's recommendation, which at the end of the day is the crucial reason why he lost. The Labour Party got an enormous stooshy about the referendum, and there's still an enormous stooshy about Brexit, but they actually voted 2-1 in favour of Remain. So notice here already, even before the 2017 election, all right, Conservative voters are more likely to be Leave voters than Labour voters by a fairly substantial degree. So that's something we have to bear in mind. You will also notice this, by the way, in doing 30 years of social survey research. It's the first time ever that I've got 100% of a category that have done exactly the same thing. Because the thing that usually happens when I give talks like this and you show that 98% of UKIP supporters voted for Leave is that somebody pops up and says, how do you explain the 2% of UKIP voters who voted Remain? And I just go, error, ignore, irrelevant. But this time, first time ever, 100% of those people in British Social Attitudes 2016 who said that they identified with UKIP voted for Leave. So if nothing else can hopefully persuade you of the validity of this data, that this hopefully should enable you to do so. And meanwhile, as you will see, I think there's a mistake there in my data thing, but the Liberal Democrats actually voted overwhelmingly. That should be a higher number. Liberal Democrats voted overwhelmingly for Remain, but they're not unanimously. Okay, so you can see therefore that if indeed some people at least, voted on the basis of Brexit as opposed to on the basis of traditional arguments about politics of the left and right, this is potentially at least disruptive of traditional patterns of support for the two largest parties. Not wholly disruptive, but potentially disruptive. But of course that does beg a question, which is first of all is, well, actually, given the relative ineffectiveness of the parties at persuading their supporters to follow the party line in the referendum last year, how effective are they at communicating their positions to the electorate during the election? Now this comes from a YouGov survey in which people were asked to say, where do you think, this is during the middle of the election campaign, where do you think the parties stand? And so the far left-hand side is opposed to Brexit. Then you've got, there should be a second referendum. Then you've got basically a description of a soft Brexit. You know, we should still be in the single market and quite close. And then there's a hard Brexit description. And then also, not clear, don't know who are the Liberal Democrats. Now, the differences are not enormous, but notice that the modal voter does associate the Conservative Party with a hard Brexit. The modal voter associates the Labour Party with a soft Brexit, although a lot of people said don't know. And the Liberal Democrats, actually, the modal voter is don't know. So why, which is one obvious question, is given they are the most pro-Brexit party, did the Liberal Democrats not succeed, which is not really a question I'm going to answer in the talk, but one of the reasons is that not enough people knew that associated with the idea of the second referendum in the first place. And meanwhile, yes, most people realised that UKIP wanted a hard Brexit. So the signals are not as strong as they might be, but they were there. But now look at something else. This comes from the British election study, and this is asking people about where they think the parties stand on the question of immigration. It's a 0 to 10 scale. So you said 0 if you said, I think this party wants many fewer migrants to come to the UK, and you scored 10 if you think they want to allow many more. And what I'm showing here is the average score amongst those people who felt able to give the party a score. And you will notice straight away that the Conservatives are given a score of about 3, Labour traditionally on average is a score about between 6 and 7, i.e. when it comes to the issue of migration, there is a very sharp difference in voters' perceptions of where our two largest parties stand. And insofar as migration is the central issue of the Brexit referendum, and certainly if we're now thinking of Brexit as being an indicator of a broader set of socially conservative versus socially liberal values, you can see how the images of our two largest parties may actually be sufficiently strong to begin to mean that if people do start voting along the lines of Brexit, this could make a difference to the kinds of people who vote for them. Well, did it? Well, I can show you this, and you can probably think, oh, thank God, he's just about to shut up, and he's meant to be going off another 10 minutes, but actually he's going to shut up. Bad news if that's what you were hoping. This is ICM's opinion polls during the campaign, aggregated together. So the ones at the beginning here, these are the ones actually just before Theresa May made her fateful announcement. These are polls from very late in the campaign, and there's 3 or 4 aggregated together to get decent numbers. This is showing you the voting intentions of those people who voted Leave in 2016. And you can look at this and you can say nothing doing. Yes, you can see that Leave voters were much more likely to vote Conservative than vote Labour, but given I've already shown you that existing Conservative voters voted Leave, that shouldn't surprise you. But you'll also notice the Conservative vote goes up amongst Leave voters by around 5 points, but so also does it by Labour vote go up. The UKIP vote collapses, and that's the early part of the campaign. But you look at that and you would say nothing doing, because both parties during the campaign look as though they gained equally amongst Leave voters. However, if I now show you the numbers from the same polls for Remain voters, you see a different story. You will notice that the Conservative vote actually falls during the election campaign amongst those people who voted Remain, and the increase in the Labour vote at 13 points is much larger amongst Remain voters than I showed you just now amongst Leave voters. So we can already begin to see here that during that election campaign, in which Brexit was arguably not talked about as much as we might anticipate, actually voters who Remain voters and Leave voters were moving somewhat differently in the direction of their support. But primarily what I'm interested in is how things differ now in 2017 with how they looked in the 2015 general election. So here's exhibit 1 on that. So this is a poll done by Lord Ashcroft. He asked people how they voted in 2015 as well as how they voted in 2017. Left-hand side are Remain voters, right-hand side are Leave voters, and you're going to do quite a few tables like this. So let's just walk you through it. So you'll see that amongst Remain voters, 30% said they voted Conservative in 2015, whereas 41% said they voted Labour. So Remain voters were already rather more inclined to vote Labour. But in the 2017 election, the Conservative support amongst Remain voters in this poll is 5 points lower than it was 2 years previously, whereas Labour's vote is 10 points higher. And that's the divergence I'm interested in. Okay, so you can see here that amongst Remain voters, Labour gained ground, and the Conservatives actually are doing less well than they did 2 years previously. Amongst Leave voters, yes, Labour also gained ground, which is kind of what you might expect given what I show you happened during the campaign, but the Conservatives make ground much more. The Conservative vote, 45% of Leave voters in 2015, 60% in 2017. Labour's up, but it's only up by 5 points, less than it is amongst Remain voters. So it looks as though the aggregate pattern of party support, or at least the changes in party support, the aggregate changes in party support, are associated with how people voted in the EU referendum. As I said, I often show you more than one source. Here's the British election study using the most recent wave, and that finds the Conservative vote again down amongst Remain voters, up amongst Leave voters, Labour up in both, but up more amongst Remain voters than amongst Leave voters. So again, two different sources, very consistent story. You can also do a similar analysis according to how do people stand on the issue of what kind of Brexit do people want, which arguably was the issue that now faced people in the election. So this is data from the British election study, which again gives people one of those classic questions of, which should be the government's negotiating priority, staying in the single market or being able to control immigration. The figures in brackets here are the percentage of people in each group. We're very divided on this issue still. You will notice that amongst those who want to control immigration, we're much more likely to vote for the Conservatives than those those in favour of the single market were much more likely to vote for Labour. But again, notice here I've just shown you the change figures. Conservative support goes up markedly amongst those who wish to control immigration as their principal Brexit priority. Labour's vote is up amongst both groups, but it's up more amongst those for whom single market is the priority than it is those who wish to end freedom of movement. And again, similar, this is a survey that I'm running on the mixed probability sample, which asks people, like, if the only way we can get free trade is to agree to freedom of movement, as Noel Edmonds would say, is it deal or no deal? All right? And these are the folk who want to do a deal. These are the folk who think we shouldn't do a deal. Notice that the Conservative vote goes up more and is also higher amongst those people who definitely would not be willing to trade being able to end freedom of movement for the single market, whereas Labour vote, actually on this there isn't much of a difference on the change, but again notice the Labour Party, it consists much more of people who at the end of the day would do a deal if the EU were to require us to do so. If we come to the central issue of immigration, we again see a very sharp difference in the patterns and changes in party support. So again, this is another question from British Social Attitudes. So people are asked, look, does the fact that we have people coming to this country from outside, is this something that undermines British culture or does it enrich it? The people at the top are the people who think it undermines, the bottom are the people who think it's enriched, and it's a 10-point scale, so there are various things in between. Notice how the Conservative vote goes up very heavily amongst those people who think that immigration undermines UK culture, and the Labour vote goes up above all amongst those who say no, it enriches our cultural life. Very, very sharp division by people's perceptions of the cultural consequences of immigration. And therefore, it probably won't also therefore surprise you that if I now go back to that conceptual definition of social liberal versus social conservative, I again can replicate these patterns. Those people who are socially conservative are more likely to vote for the Conservatives, and support for the party increases amongst this group, whereas support for Labour goes up much more amongst social liberals. Which therefore means that whereas I showed you that in 2015, this division made a bit of a difference to your chances of voting Conservative or Labour, but not that much, it now makes quite a marked difference to your probability of being a Conservative or a Labour voter. And if you use this is another survey, this is using British social attitudes, again, very similar picture of how the Labour Party gains amongst social liberals above all, and the Conservative Party gains amongst social conservatives and loses amongst social liberals. So again, more than one source gives you exactly the same story. In contrast, and this arguably is a crucial question the Labour Party is going to have to sort out for itself, whether or not you're left-wing or right-wing, actually, so far as the Conservatives are concerned on the British election study panel, made no difference at all to the probability of your becoming a Conservative voter. So there's a big difference, but the gap's no wider than it was 2 years previously. On the Labour side, yeah, okay, the Labour Party did advance relatively strongly amongst left-wing voters, but actually it almost did it as well amongst what you might call Blairite Labour supporters. And the idea, therefore, that Corbyn's success is a consequence of the Labour Party's left-wing position, allegedly in the election, we raise some doubt. But we're still looking at a fair, it's not as though the left-right divide has been undermined by Brexit, but it certainly hasn't been strengthened. And again, you get a fairly similar story if you use the British Social Attitude Survey, though here, interestingly, the Conservatives actually lose ground amongst those on the right. And here, there isn't any evidence at all that left-wing voters moved differentially towards the Labour Party. So the element of Labour's appeal that is much more clearly related to people's willingness to switch differentially to the Labour Party is actually the party's distinctive social liberalism and not necessarily its left-wing element. Now, for many Corbynites, the two things go together. So Corbyn in his speech today both said we're opposed to any targets on immigration, a very social liberal message, and by the way, we wish to nationalise the heights of the utility economy, a very left-wing proposition. So that for them, the two things go together, but they don't necessarily go together in the wider electorate, and it's the former that seems to have been the more important stance than the latter, so far as the Labour Party gaining ground is concerned. Okay, to move towards a conclusion. What does this do to the demographics of British politics? And here perhaps is the most striking demographic statistic now about British politics. Way back in the late 1960s, Peter Pulitzer famously wrote, "Class is the basis of British politics, all else is embellishment and detail." If you were going to attempt to write that now, you would delete class and substitute age. There is now the most remarkable age differential in Conservative and Labour support of the kind that we have never previously seen in post-war British politics. It began to emerge in the 2015 election, by the way, so if you actually go back to 2010, these figures are even further apart from each other. But as you can see, the Conservative Party here on this source, which is the British election study, losing ground amongst 18 to 25-year-olds, gaining ground amongst the 66 pluses. They weren't caring about paying for their social care, were they? And the young people, all those stories which are young people voting for the Labour Party in very strong numbers, but amongst older people hardly increasing at all. Partly, of course, because the Labour Party was mobilising young people who hadn't previously voted. Very, very striking. Second thing that you then also find is that, indeed, the Conservative Party gained ground amongst people without educational qualifications, lost ground amongst graduates. The Labour Party tended, if anything, to gain ground amongst those with a degree. Indeed, you'll notice that not far short of 50% of university graduates voted Labour. Indeed, the level of support for the Labour Party amongst university graduates ain't that far short of the level of support for the Labour Party amongst those whom we would as saying as having working class occupations. The Labour Party might have been founded as the party of the working man and woman, but it's frankly become, in many respects now, the party of the working professional graduate. And that is clearly disruptive of the traditional patterns of British politics. And I just, it's what, if you watch the sociology of the Labour Party conference, yes, you can still find people whom you might think of as being traditional, older, working class. But so many of the people you will see in that conference hall are professional, middle-class graduates. And that is also now reflective of the support for the party. And notice in particular, Labour more popular amongst university graduates than it is amongst those without any educational qualifications in this area. It's not quite so strong here, but again, still very high level support amongst graduates. And notice that the Conservative Party, again, losing ground amongst university graduates, most of whom are in professional middle class jobs and who therefore traditionally would be expected to be Conservative voters. So the change in the aggregate patterns cuts across the traditional divide of British politics, and yep, as you might guess, it does therefore also mean that the Conservative Party tended, it's not enormous, but again, tended to lose ground amongst those people in middle class occupations, gained ground amongst those in working class occupations, whereas in the case of Labour, well, if anything, the increase was least amongst this group. So we're now, it's not as though the left-right division has disappeared, it's still there. It's not this class doesn't matter, it does still matter, but it's been joined by age, which is now a really big division, education, and whether people are socially liberal or socially conservative. So although we may have a politics that's dominated by two parties, it's not a politics which is underpinned by one dimension, one value dimension across which the political and electoral and ideological battle is being fought. It's a two-dimensional space, and it's not being fought over one demographic social class, it's also being fought over age, it's also being fought over educational background. All these things are to some degree related to each other, but they are not exactly the same motivators. So one of the things, therefore, that my colleagues at NatSen did, which we initially began to unveil on Sunday, though actually, frankly, if you're watching Peston on Sunday, you wouldn't have realised what the hell was being said, because they do it so fast. So we used a statistical technique that's becoming a bit popular these days called latent class analysis, in which basically you take a whole bunch of variables and you try to identify what are the common classes or groups or tribes of people that exist out there. So in this otherwise potentially multi-dimensional space. I won't go through all this. I'll maybe just put it back up for while we're doing the Q&A. But what I would invite you to note about it, I mean, two of the groups, Comfortable Britain and Traditional Working Class, are primarily people whose distinctive character, that these groups are distinctive with respect to the fact that they are right or left wing, and whether or not they are in middle class or working class jobs. So that's where the traditional class and left-right structure is still evident in the composition of the political tribes. But then notice that there are other groups whose principal characteristic is that they're social liberals, and that they may also tend to be rather young. So in the second group are the liberal elite. These are the Ramonas, right? Okay, many of them in universities. Right? These are socially liberal graduates in professional occupations who love the diverse world of our metropolitan areas. Okay, they're joined, by the way, by lots of younger people who are not necessarily been to university, but because they are young, they're relatively liberal and they're relatively positive about immigration. That's the other kind of clear liberal group in our society. We've then got the group that's closest to the so-called left behind. These are older, working class people, little in the way of educational qualifications, deeply concerned about immigration, and nearly all of them, to a man and a woman, voted Leave. And then you've got the group in the middle here. This is the group that Corbyn got to a degree to the polls, because then virtually none of them voted in 2015, but they're not particularly left-wing. Note. Okay. This is indeed how these groups fall out. As you might expect, comfortable Britain votes Conservative. Traditional working class Britain actually doesn't vote Labour anymore. That's part of Labour's problem. Who votes Labour? The liberal elite sitting in universities, and those of your contemporaries who perhaps were not quite so lucky to go to university, or perhaps maybe had the sense not to go to university, but who've got quite good jobs and are kind of hoping to get on the housing ladder, and frankly are not terribly concerned about immigration. They also voted Labour. All right? The Conservatives, together with those professional, older people, have got a very different demographic of the socially left behind, and they don't do that badly amongst this group either. So one of the things, therefore, to realise is that because this is a multidimensional space, it begins to create tensions in the electoral coalitions of our two largest parties. Think in particular about the Conservative Party. Conservative Party is traditionally thought of as the party that represents and advocates the interests of big business in our society. But it now has an electorate which is overwhelmingly pro-hard Brexit, pro-leave, which is not where big business is at. And, you know, behind all these arguments about, you know, why does Johnson disagree with May, do Philip Hammond and David Davis talk to each other, and all that kind of day-to-day tittle-tattle, there is a real a problem and tension inside the Conservative Party between those who, at the end of the day, are primarily, they're economic liberals and they're primarily concerned to maintain the process of globalisation, versus those who are much more socially conservative and who have a very different disposition. And that's a real ideological tension. Equally inside the Labour Party, you know, why is the Labour Party still not being explicit about Brexit? Yes, it's got a majority of social liberals, many of whom would like a second referendum, but there are enough social conservatives still voting for the Labour Party because they're also left-wing. That creates problems for that party. Again, this is showing you how the tribes moved. So the Labour Party gains amongst the liberal elite, the liberal youth. It does actually gain some amongst the young behind. Here's the disaffected jams, no longer abstaining, voting for Labour. Comfortable Britain, the traditional conservative Britain, basically didn't change its mind in 2015. It's very, very similar to what 2017 is very similar to what it was before. Okay, so the other, why are the tribes like this? Well, there's one other way of looking at this, which I thought I would leave you at the end, which in a sense explains a great deal. Remember right at the beginning, I said to you, UKIP voters, very, very socially conservative. And that was what, they were not right-wing, but they were socially conservative. Now, what I'm showing you here is a calculation for the British Election Panel Study, showing you the net consequences of transfers between A, Labour, and B, the Conservatives, and the other parties. So the first line, for example, is saying to you that in this study, Labour's support in the sample as a whole goes up by 5 points as a result of people who abstained in 2015 voting for the party in 2017. This is Labour Party's political mobility. And you will notice that something like a half of all of the increase in Labour support in this panel study comes from that source. But it's not the only source. The other half comes from interchanges from everybody else. The Labour Party makes net gains from UKIP, the Tories, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the SNP, Uncle Tom Cobley and all. All right? But they are therefore gaining across the piece. The Conservatives, meanwhile, without the switch from UKIP, the Conservative vote would have been more or less the same as it was in 2015. If that drop in UKIP support had not happened within the first 3 days of the election campaign, Theresa May would have been well and truly snookered. And we would probably now have a Labour government. all the other transfers basically cancel each other out. They gain a bit from abstention. They lose transfers to Labour. They lose to virtually everybody else, apart from the SNP. So again, given those wellsprings of support, given the Conservatives' principal additions were from socially conservative UKIP voters, what I've shown you shouldn't come as a surprise. And the fact that although Labour's vote is partly to do with mobilisation, A, the fact that the mobilised were not necessarily particularly left-wing, and B, the party was winning over voters from other parties, we again should not be surprised that the Labour Party was winning over voters of the kinds that you may not traditionally have associated with the party. Okay, so that's basically my conclusion. The Conservatives advanced most amongst Leave and therefore socially conservative voters. Labour, the opposite, although not so strong, and they're also mobilising the politically disaffected. This cuts across, although it doesn't eliminate the traditional divisions of class and left-right, but it does mean that age, not class, is now the biggest demographic divide in British politics, and that because it's now a multi-dimensional space that has been shoehorned into a two-party system, both parties have potentially fragile cross-cutting coalitions, at least for so long as Brexit remains a central issue of British politics. And I suspect that that's probably one of the safer predictions that I would have made in my political science career.